We will go ahead. I will go ahead and now, and we'll do some little claps and introduce our next speaker, Mark Obeten of Marquette University, who will be talking about decolonization and psychic conversion, a theological appraisal of the challenges of Africa's developmental strides from the prism of Robert Doran's psychic conversion. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and read the thoughts I have here. The colonization of Africa affected all aspects of life, hence the quest for decolonization equally concerns all aspects of our life, including theological contributions towards development. For a continent with a checkered history of slave trade and colonization, and currently bedeviled with varied challenges of underdevelopment and leadership loopholes, Africa has consistently been positioned in the last rung of the ladder of development. Decades after the end of colonial regimes and the institution of indigenous government, this paper engages the reality and extent of freedom from the Western powers. It argues, among other things, that political independence without economic and psychical freedom is a half measure. It maintains that this situation of neocolonialism, in which most governments still depend directly or indirectly on the Western influence and approval to act, is a major clog in the wheel of progress and development in Africa. The goal of this paper is not just to lament and call out the injustice and brutality of colonization, as this might simply amount to crying over spilled milk. Of course, it is my intention to state the woes of colonialism, but more than that, to essentially steer the African conscience and stimulate it to further action against the Western grasp of her destiny. In other words, this paper argues that the developmental challenge of the African continent is not dissociated from her experience of slave trade and colonialism. It appreciates the political, intellectual, moral, and even religious decolonization drives so far, but then argues that the psychic element in the struggle for freedom, which has not been significantly attended to, must now be explored with the intensity and intentionality with which political independence was pursued in the mid-20th century. I turn to, in this paper, to Robert Doran, influenced as he was by the thoughts of Bernard Lonergan on conversion, to argue that the cycle of change on the march to wholesome authenticity never reaches completion without the sublation of the religious, moral, and intellectual conversion of the existential subject. And now I would start by tracing the roots of underdevelopment in Africa. The Janus-faced situation of the continent of Africa is one that is fed by tributaries of several levels of binarism. There is an admixture of hope and despair, demonstrated by the stories of the stinkingly rich in a constant effort to overshadow the fragrantly poor of the society. Interestingly, one is right about the stench of riches and the aroma of poverty that oozes out of the same continent, same country, or in some cases, the opposite sides of the same street. This doubt is worsened by the fact that evidence abound as to people and governments that have cried for and received help for the fight against poverty and illiteracy, but have embezzled such proceeds for personal use. Yet there are stories of people who genuinely get aid from outside and actually use that to help in the fight against poverty and infrastructural lack. The discovery, manufacture, and advancement of modes of transportation has also led to many interactions between Africa and other parts of the world. This interaction between the West and the sub-Saharan Africa since the 15th century gradually inaugurated an era of transatlantic slave trade, a system that has come to be referred to as Western imperialism, in which more than 90% of Africa lost sovereignty and control of natural resources. Attempts to check this sad reality led to the abolition of slave trade. Sadly, however, while efforts to abolish slave trade in Africa were reaching their zenith, the scramble and partitioning of the African continent in the All-European Berlin Conference on Africa in 1884 inaugurated an era of colonialism to perpetuate Europe's hold on African people and resources. A traditional African sense of simplicity and hospitality was taken advantage of and battered by the European invaders. According to Robert Boyce, indeed, there was no form of trickery that was not practiced on these poor Black children of Africa. The African commercial exploiter was face to face with a more simple-minded race and took a mean advantage of his position with the native Black. This is derogatory but true. Trickery feasted on simplicity. Now I want to lead us to looking at the ethnicity and the Western conspiracy that had to do with where development has reached in Africa. A close look at the present-day map of Africa will show how colonization brought about a forced amalgamation of peoples who had very little or nothing in common and bundled them under one nation. This is how one might explain the cascade of civil wars and heightened communal clashes that have continued to plague and ripple through the continent, without prejudice to the existence of intertribal attritions prior to colonialism. To this day, Africans identify themselves more by ethnicity, Yoruba, Igbo, Tutsi, Maasai, rather than by nationality. The colonizers did not leave Africa without offering their colonies a seat on a keg of gunpowder, a crocodile smile, you may say, as strategy to perpetuate their strangle on the African continent. For example, in the case of Nigeria, renowned literature giant Chinua Achebe maintained that the Igbos, who were the most qualified in many sectors in the Nigerian government at the eve of the independence, were never appointed to leadership roles. For him, this might only be explained as a continuity with the grand plan of the colonizers, who had strategized to carefully ensure the nation's independence was shrined in dependence. According to Achebe, the ploy in the Nigerian context was simple and crude. Get the achievers out and replace them with less qualified individuals from the desired ethnic background so as to gain access to the resources of the state. No doubt, this subtle seed of discord did not take too long to bear fruit. By 1966, Nigeria had a first military coup, and a year later, a civil war that claimed no less than 3 million lives was in progress. Hence, rather than nation building and development, African countries are having civil wars and clashes to grapple with. Perhaps the most devastating blow against the Africans was the hijack and disintegration of the African system of education, a direct attack on the African psyche and mindset. The African system of education was soon to be judged worthless and defunct, and quickly replaced by an educational system convoluted with school curriculum that was not just foreign to the African, but also designed to perpetuate African servitude and dependence on the West. The content of these curricula were not suitable for the African experience and need, not just the language, but also the very concepts they identified were strange to the African child in its environment. Hence, education became the medium of oppression with the result that decades after colonization, the African is stuck with a reconstructed mental framework patterned to serve the Western constructs of modernity and epistemology. African systems of education, like our religions and other elements of our culture, were contemptuously written off, and this content sunk into the African thought was a Western education mold. Language was no longer a vehicle for development, but an obstacle and perhaps an end in itself. So at this point, we want to raise the pertinent question: what is psychic conversion and how does it relate to this African story? Psychic conversion is Robert Doran's contribution to Bernard Lonergan's theology in respect to conversion. Lonergan's works demonstrate that the combating of bias is critical to the subject matter of conversion. The idea of self-transcendence is the key driver of conversion, and herein lies the capacity for transforming oneself and one's world. Lonergan identified a threefold dimension to conversion: intellectual, moral, and religious, and Doran introduced a fourth, the psychic. In Lonergan, authenticity and self-transcendence play a pivotal role in the understanding of human development at the individual and communal levels. Little wonder then the operations of experience, understanding, judgment combine to authenticate knowledge. Arriving at this authentic knowledge is always the implication of an intellectual conversion, where one must have moved from a shallow or totally wrong notion to a fuller or truer knowledge, from a cycle of experience, insight, judgment, and decision. Since the threefold categories of conversion must work together towards authenticating the human experience of the subject, knowledge after intellectual conversion must inform the choices of the individual, and it means a movement from what satisfies to what is of higher value. This way, transformation, or if you like, transvaluation, positions the subject to being in love with God and being truly committed to his labor of love in a religious sense. The interaction between the intellectual, moral, and religious levels of conversion is what authenticates human transformation. But how can conversion be authentic if it is not holistic, or if it leaves out the psychic, the mental, and the inner force of human activities and decision-making? Such a question motivated Doran to seeking a way of better understanding and maximizing the benefits of Lonergan's contribution to the theme of conversion. The end result of Doran's study in this regard was the introduction of psychic conversion. Doran maintains openly that psychic conversion makes sense and finds its relevance within the framework of Lonergan's threefold conversion. For Doran, psychic conversion is integrally related to the religious, moral, and intellectual conversion specified by Bernard Lonergan as qualifying authentic human subjectivity. Doran went on immediately to restate the intricate link between conversion and theological foundation in Lonergan. This foundation demands, as its context, a break from the classical mediation of meaning, distinct from the citation of scripture and enunciation of revealed doctrines, characteristic of the old dogmatic theology. This is very instructive to the African context of decolonization and the quest for development. For example, Cyril Orji has restated Doran's appropriation of Lonergan's contribution to conversion by asserting that conversion is not a one single event, but a process that involves the radical about-face in which one repudiates characteristic features of one's previous horizon. According to Doran, the conscious capacity for the sublation of the imaginal is effected by a conversion on the part of the existential subject. The notion of sublation, which he takes from Lonergan is very momentous to the comprehension of Lonergan's psychic conversion theory and how it can be a tool for decolonization and development. Doran emphasizes that psychic conversion does not claim to displace Lonergan's 3 levels of conversion, nor present itself as a perfect form or the completion of the conversion circle. Instead, he asserts, like any other conversion, psychic conversion is not the goal but the beginning. As religious conversion is not the mystic's cloud of unknowing, as moral conversion is not moral perfection, as intellectual conversion is not methodological craftsmanship, so psychic conversion is not unified affectivity or total integration with intentionality or immediate release from psychic imprisonment. Thus, Doran stresses the psychic conversion as a beginning, a moment when a person begins to take seriously the need to make decisions from a more authentic consciousness of fuller knowledge and higher value, rather than from the throne of ego. This conversion helps to make for a more holistic view of the situation and takes the long-term best approach to life and decisions. Doran explains, it is at the beginning no more than the obscure understanding of the nourishing potential of the psyche to maintain the vitality of conscious living by a conscious influx of energy. The hint that one's psychic being can be transformed so as to aid one in the quest for individual authenticity. The suspicion that coming to terms with one's dreams will profoundly change one's ego by ousting it from its central dominating position to one's conscious living, by shifting the birthplace of meaning. Sorry. So Lonergan, Doran is simply saying that there is a need to work on the ego in such a way that the psychic element, which is a more advanced faculty, has the lead in the final decision that a person makes. The capacity of the psyche for a deeper level of consciousness properly positions the individual to desire and to appreciate the changes that come from harnessing psychic component by breaking forth an egoistic dominance. And this is what is needed to overcome selfishness and greed, which is so often associated with leadership in the African continent. 2 rather deep questions give bearing to Lonergan's engagement with the quest for a psychic conversion, positioning his theory naturally relevant to the interest of this paper. First, he inquires, how do we recover the story in which is verified the authenticity or inauthenticity, both of our judgment of value and of our consequent cognitional value? This question is equally critical to the African situation as regards decolonization. It is asking, in essence, how sure are the Africans that they are addressing the real issues militating against progress and development in the continent, given the intentionally designed mental distortion by a foreign colonial educational system and a rather twisted history? How sure is the African that he is addressing his own rather than a different story imposed by Western powers and the ripple effects therefrom? Doran poses a second question thus: how do we move from this recovery to assume our distinct historical responsibility for the concrete process of the human good? This second inquiry targets the indigenous responsibility for retelling the African story and the steering of the wheels of progress in the continent. So Doran's take-off questions challenge the African to rise and to raise the right questions, as well as take responsibility for addressing these issues. Yeah, now psychic conversion and the task of decolonization. I have to run through this now. If the human person is naturally a political animal and the African religious, when shall we make an entry into psychic conversion? According to Obayton, centuries of colonial domination of Africa have resulted in a historical psychological conditioning of Africans that manifests itself in a defeatist mentality, a self-perception incapable of envisioning progress, and perpetual confinement in a straitjacket of misery. Simply put, if the African doesn't see himself or herself as having the capacity to think beyond what they have been told they are, then it is difficult to make any move. I would take a quote from Frantz Fanon before I move to the concluding part of this argument. Frantz Fanon once wrote, "Colonialism is not simply content to impose its rule upon the present and future of a dominated country. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all forms and content. By a form of perverse logic, it turns the past of the oppressed people and distorts it. It disfigures it and destroys it. It is in this light that the question regarding the nature of freedom gained at independence from colonial rule takes its relevance even today. If colonialism is structured to place a grip on both present and the future and is used to distort the African's mindset to servitude, how authentically realistic then is the independence that African nations have gotten? Thus, the need to continue the struggle for independence, albeit through decolonization and precisely through a psychic conversion that repositions the African in a more confident and forward-looking posture. This consideration of Doran will not be complete without looking at something on limitation and transcendence. Simply put, Doran argues that we must not stay just by looking at the transcendent, but there must be a need to accept the limitation of the African continent and the African person while looking forward to conversion as also a gift of grace. By and large, this is my conclusion, please. By and large, to liberate masses, decolonization is a commitment to liberate masses of Africans from their subservience to a collective oppressive colonial mentality and memory. There is a need to expand the understanding and pursuits of conversion in the religious environment or atmosphere of the continent of Africa. In this paper, I have attempted to establish that there was a grave need for development in Africa by building a background to current challenges of Africa and linking this to slave trade and colonialism, and pointing out the immediate culprit for this situation, and this is the ineptitude of African elites. There is a failure in leadership, and this needs some kind of conversion to see that the leaders are able to think more of future rather than just what is completed here and now. So Doran talks of long-term solutions. This background then weaved into Doran's psychic conversion as influenced by Bernard Lonergan. Hence, the argument of this write-up simply is that psychic conversion is an essential part of decolonization, and by this very fact, a radical catalyst for development in Africa. An understanding and application of sublation as envisioned by Doran's psychic conversion would have considered an eclectic and more productive fusion in the fight against underdevelopment in Africa. Yeah, thank you very much for your audience. I would open up for questions. If there are any questions or clarifications or contributions, that would be most welcome. Yes, Dr. Ogbonnaya.
Thank you, Mark, for your very stimulating paper. And of course, I'm from Africa, and your paper resonates completely with my own experience. My question is, how do you envision psychic conversion to make a contribution to the trauma arising from colonialism, especially as most of the leaders of Africa are still caught up heavily, big time, to colonial mentalities? The whole idea of stealing money, borrowing money from international agencies, embezzling this money, stashing the money back to many foreign banks, leaving their various countries in big debts while they are living in superfluous wealth. I consider that to be one of the traumas they may not even know they are suffering. So how do you think psychic conversion would make a contribution to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ogbonnaya. It's also good that you are the one raising this question because in the fuller paper that I wrote addressing this topic, I actually took a quote from your book on Lonergan and social transformation. And I think that is a way of looking at how it is good. First, in that book, you already identified the fact that there is some kind of schizophrenia, which means that most African leaders have already lost touch of their authentic selves. So in most cases, they are pursuing some greed or selfish ways, such that even instead of looking inward and building on what is available, they are rather looking outward, unknown to them that this is also going back to some form of colonialism. So in his book also, Emmanuel Katangole talks about the need for Africans to go back to the kind of solution that Thomas Sankara had in Upper Volta. So in essence, I am saying that a psychic conversion can contribute to this by inviting these leaders to look at the long-term goals, because Lonergan argues that, Doran argues that when people look only at the here and now, there is this idea of immediate gratification that most African leaders seek. You know, are we able to plant trees from whose fruits we cannot eat because we would have been dead and gone, but we are very optimistic that future generations can reap from this? So the authenticity in that subject is the fact that the subject is able to look beyond his or her own needs to look at what does community really needs. So this has to do with, I agree with you, the healing of an individual bias in the African political elite. And that is what will help them to see that running to get loans and all of those would not be the solution, but an increased self-awareness and increased self-image will be able to help in that. Because I can tell you, most governments that take these loans have no plan for repaying these loans. So at the end of it, what has happened is that they will bequeath future generations burdens of debts that they can't handle. So You are the professor. I don't know if I've attended to your question, but that's my. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we could take another. Cecilia, I think I see your hand. Please make your contribution.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for that. I thought your talk really resonated with me, myself being a daughter of colonialism in Singapore, growing up in Singapore. And I myself have understood and experienced the kind of aberration and distorted thinking that colonialism can bring to groups of people. So I have some questions that you and wonder, which I would like you to perhaps comment on in the African context. And this is something that I have to admit I am ignorant about, and the fact that one of the things I feel that we should, or I should, move away from is to collectively call all the peoples under one continent, because to constantly talk about the African context, I think diminishes and it disrespects the actual cultural, the diversity of the cultural and religious and social contributions that each group has made. It's lumping everything into one. So in that sense, I don't know if perhaps one is a question of language. Number two, the whole question of truth and reconciliation. How much of that has been attempted in terms of trying to address the intergenerational or generational trauma arising from colonialism? And the church's role, because the churches and Christianity's role in the decolonizing of colonized minds. I mean, it is no secret that a lot of our thoughts and what we have come to perceive of ourselves as subjects in relation to Christian doctrine has worked in tandem with colonization, and also something of our own, of something of the patriarchal and hierarchical culture of different groups. Is there a need to recover perhaps from the various groups, different tribal groups, different ethnic groups, their sense of community, their sense of what it is to be community? You know, the other thing that that bothers me quite a bit is that we are constantly referring to Ubuntu or to I am because we are, right? But they become aphorisms so easily thrown about. So how does one, without just appropriating those words, it's just what happens as well in Australia, where certain Aboriginal words and concepts are given tokenistic meaning. Just because you say it, just because you think you know it or what it means you are okay, you're inclusive. So the other one is also about language, and the recovery of wisdom and in the culture, in the language, in the tradition, in the history, because there's so much dismantling of history. How does how do people recover that history, which is often oral history? And the last question, current context of the inroad of China. Is this a new form of imperialism and colonism in terms of the way they are making inroads into places and in the particularly, I mean, I just was in a conversation with a Kenyan priest, recently, who was talking about the Chinese coming into Kenya and so forth. And then, there was a conversation about, him expressing, oh, the Chinese, they eat everything. That's why there are no dogs in Kenya. So we're talking about cross-cultural tensions, which really is also part and parcel of this whole milieu of colonization, past colonization, and perhaps new colonization that's occurring now. Thank you so much for your paper.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was great. I take that as a big contribution. But then to attend to your questions, I think I can start from where you dropped off. The idea about China, is this a new imperialism or colonialism? I think I would just say, like the response I gave to Ogbonnaya, this is where psychic conversion can really play a big part, because China does not force loans on any country in Africa. Our leaders, the same African leaders, go to ask for these loans because they have not been, they are not like living out this authentic maturity to know that if you take these loans, these conditions are not healthy at all. These conditions are not helping the people who receive the loans, but those who give. Because Zambia has almost been bought off by China based on loans and the conditions. And this is true for several other countries. So it is to say that there is a way in which the African elite is looking for the easy solution. Oh, get the loans, construct these roads. But what about paying for these loans? So I agree with you, there is this form of imperialism, but China is doing it with some kind of business sense, saying you have this loan, these are the conditions. But who is even reading these terms or trying to say, yes, we agree with these terms or not? And that's a big question. And it's true, as you say, Africans really need to consider this and react accordingly. The church's role for psychic conversion and addressing the problems in Africa. Yeah, this is where we have so much we can say, but for now, I'll simply say that one is, as I stated in this paper, there is a need for even the conversion of religious conversion. And that is where psychic conversion, Doran talks about sublation, that the religious conversion does not end the cycle. But even having been converted in the religious sense, there is a need to ask the question and even bring religion to task. The kind of Christianity and evangelical Christianity, Pentecostalism that is rife in Africa today is one that does not even encourage hard work, but turns people to miracle. Oh, say the prayers and you will receive it. So such a paper is trying to say, well, we need a conversion even from that kind of religious sense to say we need to work hard and we need to raise questions to know, to know the kind of loans we are taking and the kind of relationships we are entering into with other nations. And of course, the Ubuntu question has become very relevant in recent times. Professor Anthony Akinwale wrote a paper in which he argued that we talk about Ubuntu, but if we have this Ubuntu, this you are, I am because you are, and this love that unites us, then where are we having all these wars from? Civil wars, communal clashes in Africa, and all these disagreements. And that is what I was trying to reference in the paper by saying there is already a positioning of Africans in such a way that we have to be looking at wars and all these internal conflicts, and that is taking us away from development. That is the little I would want to say about that. And with regard to truth and reconciliation, Cecilia, you know, this is not what we can handle in these papers. We have to tell ourselves the truth. One is to accept that our leaders also, you know, have a duplicity regarding all these things we say about colonial cobwebbing. You know, the colonizers dealt with Africa, but Africans also dealt with Africans. But it's not enough to say we must continue to talk about what we did to ourselves when we have been put on this downward motion and people continually give incentives to make sure that this Western grip is there. So that is where the truth comes in. It is truth to ourselves, but also truth to the powers that tend to, you know, manipulate where we are heading. Finally, your first point is on the African context. I agree with you. And I want to say that is also a limitation in my paper. The fact that for a paper that talks about decolonization in Africa, I guess I made references to just about 5 countries in the paper, talking of a continent that has 54 countries. So sometimes it's a manner of speaking, so to say. But I agree with you, we need to do more in calling these communities in names. Cyril Orji, in his book on Lonergan, also argued that Africans do not identify themselves today as Nigeria, as Ghana, as Kenya, as much as they do as people of an ethnic group. I'm talking about, I am Yoruba, I am Igbo, I am Maasai. That is more what identifies the African. So thank you for pointing that out, and I am truly taking note of that. Okay, I see Catherine, your hand is up. Catherine, you are muted.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that, of course, we're speaking from the United States, which differs from Africa, and that all of our political leaders are personally well formed. Sorry, I had to say that. But I was wondering if I lost your picture. Did I lose your picture on purpose? Or no, they are. Okay. I was wondering, I was thinking what you were talking about in terms of Western education, okay, being a problem of bringing along suppressive ideas, you know, to the African consciousness. Well, that's the problem. There's a resonant problem in the United States, of course. My teachers that I used to talk to always have the problem that a lot of the black students that they tried to teach, and this is both from black and white teachers, that they think education is a white thing. To be educated is to accept whiteness, you know, to be the boy, you know. And so it was this real problem of trying to have them realize that their education was for them, you know, and all the things that you're talking about, which lead directly to what Lonergan refers to as the transcultural base, and not merely, I would say, accepting a lot of what Doran has to say, of course, but more about self-appropriation than psychic conversion, or to include that. But the idea of self-appropriation, which is a transcultural notion, you know, everybody asks questions of the type, what is it? The fact that comes down from Western tradition, ultimately, even though it's not merely Western tradition. It transcends Western tradition in the sense that it includes all of what human beings do, as both general and particular. That's how do you get that? The question of education and the question of interculture is to get anyone who's colonized or not, or whatever. Even the students that my teachers complained about, thinking that white meant education meant to be white, you know. To accept whiteness, white supremacy. That problem can be transcended if those insights can get across, that the idea that it's transcultural base, self-appropriation, you know, you have to use the theory to get there, but then you can abandon the theory once you realize yourself. and realize what you are as a question asking person. Anyway, I wanted to get that across. I'm totally resonant about, because it goes forward not just merely from a colonized culture, but into the whole idea of racism, you know, as experienced by Black people in this country and in other countries that are presumably democratic and not have the kinds of colonized history that you have, that Africa has. Thank you. Really, really wonderful talk. A lot opens up a whole lot of doors.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Catherine. I'll just say a few words regarding your contribution, and that is taking us back to what Doran explains very well in Psychic Conversion and Theological Foundations. I mean, was there no educational system in Africa before the colonizers? Certainly there was a system, there was a way Africans educated themselves. What would have happened if this system of education was harnessed into some eclectic form of bringing up people? But what happened was a sense of, you know, taking out everything that was in order to bring in everything that mattered to the colonizers. And there was also some kind of duplicity in that, because education was not truly to develop these people to self-reliance. And that is why the question keeps coming up. What kind of education do we have? And so thanks so much for your contribution. Yeah, do I see any other hand? Yeah, Peter, your hand was up.
Yes, that's right. I just wondered whether in the whole approach of Cosmopolis of Lonergan and Father Doran on the Holy Trinity, whether what you said about Ubuntu doesn't actually have a great relevance worldwide in that. And therefore, when we remember what happened in Europe, in European civilization, Western civilization with the world wars, where there was a total collapse of personal dignity, really, we got the United Nations as and Declaration of Human Rights as an effort to revive civilization. And we have to say in generosity that it was extended to the whole world, that the European reconciliation was really an invitation to the whole world for a new reconciliation. Now, in that sense, what you said about Africa and the problems, I'm going to ask you if the same question as I asked Ms. Copeland yesterday. Do you think that the sense of in a nationality you have, ethnicity or tribalism, if that's important for future solidarity and spreading in the world, in the sense of United Nations adopting a new universal declaration on the rights of nations, in which a lot of these ethnic and other things can be incorporated. There's 47 nations which are not sovereign.
Ask a question.
So do you think that Africa should be making a contribution in the United Nations to this new a new declaration about the rights of nations?
Okay, thanks, Peter. I am here sitting and asking myself if I can really attend to this, but very importantly, I think that Africa has lots of contribution to make. But regarding rights of nations, just from a personal viewpoint, I would say that there is, at this point, a need to get back to really giving people, you know, the kind of audience that they deserve. What I'm trying to say is there is some disequilibrium even when you come to the the UN, the United Nations. Talk about the security votes. Talk about countries that can vote, in terms of security in the International Court of Justice and all of those. Why would there be no Africans in some of these, categorizations? So my problem usually is how sincere and how authentic are these calls? If to have rights of nations means that each nation can be accounted for what it is, a sovereign state, then I think, yes, Africa has a contribution to do with that. But if this is just something we do not understand, then it means we have to study more to know exactly what it means, because it begins from the intention for such calls. And I think it's necessary to give people the opportunity to speak and be heard and be counted just as every other person is counted. As I said, it will always get back to how genuine and how authentic is this move. As far as the Ubuntu thing is concerned as making a contribution, yes, it's always a call to conversion. And interestingly, both Doran and Lonergan said conversion is not a one-off event. It's something that goes again and again. So that's another area where even Africans need to do more to accept, to love each other. Because if ethnicity means to, disagree and to fight with others, then it doesn't contribute to that idea of Ubuntu. But if it means to love one another and to see the other nation with a positive view, then that is what we're calling for in psychic conversion. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so thanks, Chris.
Mark, thank you very much for opening up all these avenues of conversation, discussion, and needed movements for the transformation of humanity and the betterment of us all.